Welcome to Codex, a history of video games. I'm Mike Coletta.
And I'm Tyler Osby.
And today we are going through some spin-offs, some side games in the Final Fantasy universe. And Tyler, take it away.
Oh man, we're here. We're at the end of a Chocobo named Desire, the final installment of the Final Fantasy history that we've been doing for what feels like months now. And actually, I think kind of is months. So,
yeah, because I was like in a canyon for a short period of time. So it's been going over a month.
So if you're listening to this podcast and you're like, gosh, when are they going to be done with Final Fantasy? This is not your lucky day, but next week is, because we are going to be done with Final Fantasy for the foreseeable future after
Would you say
today.
This is the final Final Fantasy?
It is the final Final Fantasy installment.
I might call it that. I might call it a Chocobo named Desire, the final Final Fantasy.
So some of these games that I'm going to cover are games that I have definitely played. Some of them are ones that I wish I had played, but are really just more important in like the Final Fantasy story, because I haven't played every single Final Fantasy game. Spoilers, because there are just too many. I'm not going to cover every side game and spin-off game here. That would take too long and probably be really boring. So I've kind of cherry-picked some of my favorites and some of the ones that I think are more important to the overall history of Final Fantasy.
Just like a real video game history professor.
That's right. Just like a
create
real
your
video game
curriculum.
history projector.
I like it.
Cool. Okay, so the Final Fantasy Legend. This one's important because it's the first Final Fantasy game ever released on a portable platform. It was released in 1989 in Japan and 1990 in North America for the original Game Boy. The Final Fantasy Legend was the first RPG on the Game Boy, long before Pokemon or Dragon Warrior Monsters or all those other RPGs. TFFL, as I'm calling it now for short, was crushing it with a full-blown RPG in your pocket.
That's so cool.
Yeah, and it was because this was like early days for the Game Boy, because Game Boy came out in 89, right? And so did this. So this was like super early days. It was like, what can we do with a portable platform? We know we can do Mario games with Super Mario Land. We know we can do like tons of other kinds of games, but this was the first RPG. So that's very exciting. You play as a party of 4 characters who can be a human, a mutant, or a monster. Interestingly, party members in this game are gone forever if they die in battle and they don't have any more like hearts. So every time they die, they lose a heart. And if you run out of hearts, that's it. You can't revive anymore.
It's permadeath?
Permadeath, yeah. You can pay like a whole bunch of money, I think, to get a heart back on somebody, so maybe you can revive them if they run out, but it's like super expensive. So that's pretty brutal if you ask me for a portable game. But to get around this kind of, so you don't like lose your party members forever, you can recruit new party members in town, so that kind of makes up for it. So you kind of have a rotating cast of characters. The humans can raise their stats through items that grant permanent stat boosts, while mutants gain random stat boosts after battles. Monsters eat meat that some of the enemies drop, and depending on the meat eaten, they might get stat boosts, they might get stat nerfs, and they can like evolve and change and stuff like that. So it was like a really random way of progression, which I think is kind of interesting for
this game sounds brutal.
Yeah, it's almost like a mobile game, like a current mobile game where there's just so much randomness to it of like whether or not you're going to progress. It's kind of what they're going with, although they weren't trying to sell you microtransactions on the original Game Boy.
That'd be amazing if they did, though. That'd be the first iteration of microtransactions. And the cosmetics just don't look great at all because they're on a Game Boy.
So the story takes place in a large tower, which the 4 members of the main party are trying to clear because they've heard that it leads to paradise. Now, I didn't look too deep into the plot here. I don't want to spoil it for myself. I don't want to spoil it for you. But if I had to take a guess, I would say that this tower that leads to paradise probably doesn't actually lead to paradise.
The old Paradise Tower bamboozle. We've all been there.
Yep, that's right.
I like, this kind of reminds me of the original Diablo, where you're just in one big level. I kind of like that. I like that a lot, cool. Actually.
Yeah, I think that's a neat way. Torchlight did that. The first Torchlight also did that, where you just go deeper and deeper and deeper into the dungeon, and it just gets harder and harder as you go. I really
never played those games, but that sounds cool.
Oh, they're just like Diablo. So if you've played Diablo, you've played Torchlight.
Oh, nice. I played Torchlight. But they
are pretty fun.
Look at me, sitting here not realizing I played a game already. This is fun. What a great day.
Yeah. So for Final Fantasy Legend, the game itself is important, not just for being the first portable Final Fantasy game or the first RPG on the Game Boy, but it was also the start of the Saga series that would become popular in Japan. So there's like this game, there's two more, they made two more sequels, Legend 2 and Legend 3, and then they started making games in the Saga series in Japan on the Super Nintendo. So it like kicked off a whole nother Square property that people in Japan really loved. It also,
but it was really just Japan.
Yeah, the rest of like the Final Fantasy Legend 1, 2, and 3 came out in the US. As far as I know, none of the like Saga games have come out in outside of Japan. I could be wrong about that, but that's as far as I know.
I believe you.
Yeah. The other cool thing about Final Fantasy Legend is our boy Satoshi Tajiri from Pokemon,
Ooh.
the guy who would go on to make Pokemon, was inspired by Final Fantasy Legend because when he played that, he realized that they could do that more than just action games. It could have a deep, meaningful RPG. So then he made Pokemon.
That's amazing. Oh,
I love
what would we do without these? I like these little like connections to other games that are super famous. It's one of my favorite things about doing this whole podcast with you, Tyler, and of course, hanging out with you, my dear friend Tyler.
Oh, thanks, Mike.
You didn't even say my name right. I'm just kidding.
I know. I'm having a real hard time talking today.
I would have laughed really hard if you were like, thanks, Jeff, and then just moved on seamlessly.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Okay. It's like not even close. Okay, so let's see. Where are we at here? Legend 2 got a remake on the DS in Japan in 2009, and it was called, it was part of the Saga series, but it got a remake, which is kind of neat. It was all cel-shaded and cool. The game sold really well, and it was Square's first game to sell 1 million units. So that's
good
cool.
for you, Square.
Doing a great job making people play RPGs on their long plane flights. Because the Game Boy's original battery life was like 20 hours. It was nuts.
It was so crazy. I think we definitely touched on that when we talked about the Game Boy, but the fact that there was technology in like the early 90s that you could play games for 20 hours on is pretty bonkers on AA batteries.
Crazy. Yeah, that's nuts. 4 AA batteries carry you through anything you got going on there.
That's a whole day almost.
Yep, you could nonstop play for 20 hours. Okay, so next game on the list, Final Fantasy Adventure. So the Legend series wasn't the only series of RPG that Square was making for the Game Boy. In 1991, they released the Final Fantasy Adventure, which was a lot more like a Legend of Zelda meets Final Fantasy game. So it had this like real-time combat element to it, but then there were lots of stats that would affect that combat that you would see in like a traditional RPG. So whereas like in a Zelda game, your sword hit does a sword hit's worth of damage, and like you can get upgraded swords and like stuff that does more damage, but there's no real like stats that are sort of backing the system. In Final Fantasy Adventure, you had stats like strength and HP and all that kind of stuff.
They're all about the stats, you would say.
That's right. All about them stats.
About them stats.
I don't know where to go with that. That will
No.
make it fit. No.
No numbers?
No numbers. No. Yeah, I don't know. This was the first Final Fantasy game released in Europe also, which is pretty cool.
Oh, that's actually really cool. I like that a
Yeah.
lot. Good for you, Europe. I feel bad how I feel like Europe and Australia, they really get the short end of the stick on some of these really cool games.
Yeah, they didn't get anything until like Final Fantasy VII, which is a real bummer. But they did get Final Fantasy Adventure on their Game Boy.
So I hope they played it for 20 straight hours.
Me too. A little history on the game. It was originally going to be called Seiken Densetsu, or The Emergence of Excalibur, and it was originally going to be for the Famicom Disk System. When the director said it was going to be huge and take up 5 floppy disks, it got canceled for probably unrelated reasons, but I can't help but think maybe the person who was in charge of canceling it was like, I'm not going to let you make a game that takes up 5 floppy disks.
Now, this is the time where the floppy disk was actually like the big old floppy, right?
Yeah.
Like the actual, like, is it 9-inch, 8-inch floppies?
I think what you're thinking of is the 5 1/4-inch floppies, but the Famicom Disk System was a hard-shelled floppy, more like a 3.5-inch, but I don't think it was exactly like 3.5-inch.
Say a 9-inch floppy is absurd. I don't even know what I'm talking about. That's ridiculous.
That's gigantic.
That's a gigantic disc. You'd break it so easily.
So they canceled The Emergence of Excalibur, but they used the trademark for Seiken Densetsu on a new game for the Game Boy, and they released it as Final Fantasy Adventure in North America, and in 1991, and then in 1993 they released it as a game called Mystic Quest in Europe. Hold on.
Not to be confused with, Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, which is a whole nother game.
Which is a whole nother game. Sorry, I had to sneeze there.
That's okay. Do you like how I seamlessly took over in your notes? That's what a good host does, everybody. I'm not cutting this part out, by the way. You got to get the real thing, Everyone needs to know what it's like in these podcast times,
Yeah. When you got to sneeze, nobody's stopping the timer for you. You just got to do it.
You got to have someone cover for you, and that's what we do. We got each other's back here.
That's
okay?
right. I did turn my microphone off, though, so that you wouldn't have to hear it.
Wow, you're just so thoughtful. It's like when you play Xbox with a friend, and they're eating chips in the microphone, and you're like, dude, it's seriously time to hit that mute button, buddy.
Yeah,
it's a killer.
Spare us all your chip crunching escapades.
Yeah, no one needs that at all. Okay, sorry, you can continue.
Okay, so the FF Adventure was generally well received. It was like a cool mashup of traditional Final Fantasy with some Zelda thrown in there. But this Game Boy game was also the start of a brand new series called the Mana series. And it had a sequel made on the Super Nintendo called The Secret of Mana, which became its own series separate from the Final Fantasy series. So both of these original Game Boy series spawned larger series for Square that would exist outside of Final Fantasy, which I think is very interesting. So that's cool. Final Fantasy Adventure was also re-released in 2003 as a game called Sword of Mana on the Game Boy Advance, and then it was released again on iOS, and it was called Adventures of Mana this time. So those are two separate remakes of Final Fantasy Adventure. That's neat.
You're giving away all of the remake secrets, so everyone can go find this on their iOS device or their Game Boy Advance.
Mm-hmm.
I love it.
Cool. So let's move on to Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, which is different from the Mystic Quest that was released in Europe on the Game Boy, which was Final Fantasy Adventure.
They really weren't doing themselves any favors with naming conventions.
No, they were really goofing in the early mid-90s on naming their Final Fantasy
They were just
games.
like, it's in Europe. No one will know we have another game called the same thing. It's all the way in Europe. It's not like there's some sort of information superhighway that people can access and look at stuff on. That's crazy talk.
Not back in the day, or at least if it did exist, not very many people were on it.
That dial-up swag,
Yeah. Speaking of back in the day, you remember when the United States wasn't getting very many Final Fantasy games because Square thought they were too hard?
Yeah, because they thought we were bad at video games.
a bunch of babies.
Yeah,
they thought we were bad at video games and that we wouldn't want to play something that was hard. Well,
I was so mad I cried.
Same. They still believed this, even after releasing Final Fantasy IV in the United States, which was released in Japan as the Final Fantasy USA version, or Easy Type, which is hilarious to me. But Mystic Quest was an attempt to open up the North American market for RPGs. So it was designed from the start with the United States in mind, and it was designed to be an easier entry-level RPG that anybody could get into. So the gameplay itself is pretty similar to Final Fantasy Legend 3, from the battle system to the interface to even some of the sprites being ripped straight from the Game Boy version and just given like a slight graphical upgrade and colorization. So in an effort to make this game a bit more accessible, Square removed much of the menu system and they ditched random battles altogether. They added the ability to use the sword and some items outside of battle on the overworld, which gave it a little bit more of an action-y feel, because that's what they knew they had to do to get into the hearts of the American kids.
I just wanted to swing a sword.
That's right. Well, it didn't work. The game was received generally okay, but people weren't really excited for it. It wasn't as good as Final Fantasy IV, also known as Final Fantasy II in the United States, and so that just kind of ticked off the series fans that were already in the US, and it didn't really do much to bring in new fans. So it was kind of like womp womp. But luckily, in just a year, Square would bring Final Fantasy VI to the US. They would call it Final Fantasy III, and they would give the fans what they wanted. But they still wouldn't be able to capture that mainstream success that they were looking for, at least until Final Fantasy VII, nearly 5 years later.
So what happened, in summary, TLDR, the developers thought we were bad at video games because we're in the US, and then they made it easy, and we didn't like it.
That's right. That's exactly what happened.
We're not as bad at video games as they thought.
And maybe there was some spite there because they were like, here's your easy game for you little babies in the United States. And we were like, man, that's not cool. I'm not buying this game. I want the hard game. And
we actually have the game in the box. It comes with gloves so you can hold hands with your friend because you need to hold hands with someone while you play the game. And you're like, oh,
friendship.
Thanks. Friendship. You call them friendship gloves. Final friendship.
Final friendship gloves. Okay, so the next game on the list. We're sort of going in chronological order, although I don't guarantee that all of these are in perfect chronological order.
Ooh, Tyler, this is the one I've heard of.
Yes, this one is Final Fantasy Tactics. This one's one of the more successful spin-offs of the Final Fantasy franchise. So it came out in 1997 in Japan and early 1998 in the United States, which was just a few months after it came out, or it was a few months after Final Fantasy VII came out, which was a huge success in the United States. Tactics would take the series in a different, but still kind of familiar direction. So it was a turn-based tactical RPG with heavy emphasis on where you place your characters on the map during battles. So in most Final Fantasy games, you just take turns kind of hitting each other from opposite sides of the screen. And while some games have like a front row, back row mechanism, there isn't really much positioning going on. In Final Fantasy Tactics, you were given a full like game board, and it was like playing chess with your Final Fantasy characters. If you've ever played a game like XCOM or I've talked about this one on the show, Mario plus Rabbids Kingdom Battle, that's sort of what this game is like. Is it's you got to get your characters in range and launch their attacks from different points on the map, and like high ground means something anyway. It's
also
cool.
I mean, you don't really get to choose where they are on the board, at least in the Fire Emblem I'm playing, but Fire Emblem is a lot like this too.
Yes, Fire
like
Emblem
you're in a grid and you move along the grid.
Yeah,
fight guys, it's cool.
Yeah. But the coolest thing about Final Fantasy Tactics was that it brought back the job system. So we hadn't seen the job system since Final Fantasy V, which is so exciting. So characters gain XP and job points after every move they do, not just after every battle, but everything they do, which levels up the character, levels up the job. All of the jobs are here. Like all the staples are here. The black mage, white mage, all that kind of stuff. Warrior, monk, dragoon. I think it has the most jobs. The barista job. That's right. I think it has the most jobs of any Final Fantasy game, except for maybe Final Fantasy XI, which I think ended up with 23 jobs by the end. But Tactics really kept that system going when Final Fantasy 6, 7, and 8 and 9 had all abandoned the Final Fantasy V's. Like job system where you can change jobs on different characters. So
I think I like that job system. I really do. I think it's cool to have like an extra little class that helps you out. Like just adds more depth.
Yeah. And you can change them around and like use abilities from different jobs. It's like super cool. But the other thing that Final Fantasy Tactics brought to the table was the introduction of the world of Ivalice, which is a world that they would use later in Final Fantasy XII, and they would also use it in the Vagrant story series, which is also made by Square. And that's another side story. Although Tactics, I wouldn't say, is the beginning of the Vagrant story series or anything, but they take place in the same world. So Final Fantasy Tactics sold well over 2 million copies worldwide, which makes it pretty successful by the time standards. In 2003, they made a kind of sort of sequel to the game called Final Fantasy Tactics Advance on the GBA, which had very similar gameplay, but the story was different and shorter, and like pretty much all that stuff was different. That game also got its own sequel on the DS in 2007 called Final Fantasy Tactics A2, which was pretty good as far as I know. I haven't played that one, but I think it was generally decently received. The game was also remade on PSP called Final Fantasy Tactics: The War of the Lions.
This is kind of like in the heart of the PS exclusive era, huh?
Yeah. So they all that stuff was coming out basically straight up on PlayStation consoles at that period of time.
Sony was loving it.
Oh, yeah. They were big fans of Square and Final Fantasy stuff. So yeah, then it came out on PSP in the form of Final Fantasy Tactics War of the Lions, which also got a release on iOS and Android platforms as well. I think probably playing this game on an iPad in the War of the Lions version is probably the best way to play it. Lastly, in 2017, the Stormblood expansion to Final Fantasy XIV had a set of 3 24-person raids that were heavily inspired by Tactics and the world of Ivalice. I think you fight the main character of Final Fantasy Tactics at one point in one of those raids, which I think is totally cool. I also like how in FF14, the events of Final Fantasy Tactics are told as if they're like a legend of like from a faraway land, which is neat. I think that's cool.
Wait. So you fight the character you play as in Final Fantasy Tactics?
Yeah, pretty sure that's how that goes.
That's pretty cool. I like it when games do that.
Me too. Okay, so we were just talking about how at this point in time, everything was coming out on the PlayStation. Nintendo wasn't seeing much in the way of releases to their platforms, except for the Game Boy Advance got Final Fantasy Tactics Advance. Well, in 2004, Final Fantasy made its home on the Nintendo GameCube, finally coming back to Nintendo almost 9 years after the last Final Fantasy game had been released on a Nintendo platform. And it was called Crystal Chronicles. So after the failure of Final Fantasy Spirits Within, the movie that came out in, I want to say 2001, Square was desperate for money, and they were like, where can we get more money? Can't we start putting games on Nintendo systems? And Nintendo was like, yes, you can. Here's some money. Make us a game. And so they made Crystal Chronicles. It wasn't like a mainline Final Fantasy game, but it was definitely a spin-off. It's more of an action-oriented game than other Final Fantasy games, but it has tons of the stuff in it that like make Final Fantasy games. So it has like all the spell names. I'm pretty sure it's got chocobos. It's got all kinds of stuff that you definitely know it's a Final Fantasy game when you're playing it.
If your game doesn't have chocobos, you can just throw it in the trash.
That's right.
How I feel.
Yep. If I can't ride a chocobo, I'm out.
Yeah, what's even the point?
Yeah. So one of the things that they decided to leave behind was the single-player focus that had dominated other Final Fantasy games since the beginning. Like every Final Fantasy game up to this point was a pretty much single-player affair. But this one was multiplayer. So everyone grab a controller, plug it in your GameCube, let's play some Crystal Chronicles. Only that's not how it worked. So multiplayer...
Wait,
yeah. So multiplayer in Crystal Chronicles works through the attachment of Game Boy Advance handhelds to the GameCube, meaning to play multiplayer in Crystal Chronicles, you needed 4 Game Boy Advances plus 4 of those cables to hook it up to your GameCube, which meant that most people who bought this game never ended up playing the multiplayer because who's got 4 Game Boy Advances and 4 cables to hook it up to your GameCube?
I mean, that sounds completely reasonable to me. I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah,
you know?
Well, in 2004, when I didn't have a job, it was completely unreasonable. But the gameplay itself is an action dungeon crawler where the players carry around a bucket that limits the space they can be in without taking damage. So it's so you carry a bucket and then there's like a circle around the bucket and that's where you can fight basically. I think it was meant to be like a clever way of keeping all the players on the same screen together because it was 4-player. But since one person had to be holding the bucket most of the time, it meant that person couldn't really do anything. They just had to hold the bucket, which was kind of boring. That was kind of my main beef with the game back when it came out. Characters don't level up with experience like in other Final Fantasy games. They level up from skill points accrued from accomplishing various feats within dungeons, which I think is like kind of a neat way to do progression rather than just sit there and grind out the fighting of enemies over and over. You actually have to do specific things to gain stat boosts.
Yeah, that is really cool. I agree with you with the bucket thing. The bucket thing sounds like that's the friend or sibling that you don't want to play with. You make them do the bucket thing. You know? It's ostracizing. It's not nice.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Okay, so where are we at here? Oh, so basically with Crystal Chronicles, the summary of that is it's mostly a forgettable game, but it's notable just because it's the first game that came back, the first game on a Nintendo console in almost 10 years, first Final Fantasy game, and it's strange, like huge requirements for multiplayer just make it really interesting because like other multiplayer games on the GameCube had like cool modes that would use a Game Boy Advance if you had one, but they never required it. This one required it, and that was like super weird.
Was the screen on the Game Boy Advance, would it have stuff on it while you played?
Yeah, so like that was how you did inventory management and stuff like that. So there was a reason for it, but it was like just such a bummer because it just required so much equipment to play multiplayer.
I mean, you know, someone went out there and bought 4 Game Boy Advances. Ooh,
yep,
dropping that money.
That's right. This game did get 2 more games. Well, it got several sequels. It got one for the Wii, and it got 2 sequels for the DS, and then it got 2 more Wii games on the Wii downloadable WiiWare shop. Those games are called My Life as a King and My Life as a Dark Lord. And the original game is getting a re-release on the Switch and the PlayStation 4 this year, which is pretty neat, and I hope that it has online multiplayer. This could end up being how I play this game to completion because I think it will have less strict requirements for multiplayer and probably work online too, which is pretty freaking neat.
I'm still laughing at My Life as a Dark Lord. It sounds like a really weird documentary.
Yeah, it's like it's like a life simulator kind of thing. I think I haven't really played them, but
it's Darth Vader's documentary. Is My Life as a Dark Lord.
Man, it's hard, you know. Nobody likes you.
Nobody likes you. No one sits next to you in the cafeteria on the Death Star. It's really embarrassing.
Yeah, it's tough. Okay, so next game on the list here is called Final Fantasy Dimensions. So in 2010, mobile games were really starting to pick up. They had always kind of been a thing in Japan. Remember, we had the Before Crisis game that was released in Japan. They were used to playing video games on their phone, full video games that like had meaningful experiences. In the US, we were playing like Uno and Snake on our phones, and like that's what we thought phone games were. But in 2010, they released Final Fantasy Dimensions in like an episodic format. So you would like buy an episode, play through it, and then buy the next episode and play through it. And it first came out on the FOMA 903i, which was a flip phone in Japan in 2010. But if you look at this phone, it looks like it's got a gigantic screen. Like it looks like it was before the iPhone form factor had sort of taken over everything. And there were still people who were like, yeah, no, I need a real like button pad for dialing numbers and stuff. So if you look at this phone, it's like a super... What?
People that never like stopped using a BlackBerry, like that group of people. I'm looking at it right now. It is huge.
The 903i is like this cool, like the evolution of the flip phone. Like it's if the iPhone was never created, and this is we just kept going with flip phones, we would have eventually landed on the FOMA 903i.
It flips so big that you're like, at what point does this cell phone become a laptop? That's what you're gonna worry about.
Yeah. So, but the game itself was a pretty decent Final Fantasy game. It's basically all of the game systems of Final Fantasy V, but it had a different storyline, different characters attached. And it was pretty cool. I really enjoyed it because it came out on iOS and Android worldwide in 2012. And it's like basically a full-blown Final Fantasy game. It's as long as a Final Fantasy game. It has a really cool job system like Final Fantasy V, and the story is like kind of neat. It's also sold as an episodic game, so you could buy each episode for $5 or for $20 you could unlock everything. I think there were like 5 episodes, so you ended up getting a better deal if you bought them all at once, but you could also buy them individually for $5. I think that was a fair price for the game itself, but in a world where mobile games just weren't and still aren't valued very highly, it failed to catch on. Like $20 for a phone game, like I can feel myself now being like, oh, that's not worth it, even though it was definitely, I would have paid $20 to play this on DS and it would have been the same game probably.
It really is just because of like the games we play with microtransactions, and you can't get that idea out of your head that there's games that are not like that.
Yeah. When people are like, oh, I'll never pay $20 for a phone app. And you're like, oh man, there's some really good games that are like kind of expensive in that sense, but they're like still half the price of a DS game. But that just bums me out.
A lot of the iOS Final Fantasies are like $15, which when you think about how long you'll be playing that for, it's actually a very good deal.
Yeah, I agree from a gameplay time. I wish they were cheaper just because they're such old games. But that's not to say they're not worth the money because they're full games. They're like full on. Like even $5 for a game like Grand Theft Auto 3 is like hard for some people, but that game was $50 when it came out on the PS2, and it was like a top of the line game. It was not like a crappy phone game, you know?
Yeah, totally. I feel like touch controls also just really still are not there yet. They're just never been there. I always feel weird when I play a phone game and they want you to like use the left side of the phone. At the bottom left is like an analog stick, and you're like, it just doesn't feel right. It just feels weird.
You're right. Touchscreen controls do make it a little bit tough. Anyway, Final Fantasy Dimensions did get a sequel called Final Fantasy Legends, unrelated to the Final Fantasy Legends that were on the Game Boy.
Wow, Square.
Yeah, they're really falling back on these old names. They made it first as a free-to-play game, but then they later re-released it as a paid game with most of the free-to-play stuff removed. But when you play it, you can still tell that it used to be a free-to-play game. But that's Dimensions anyway. If you're an old-school Final Fantasy fan, I say check it out because I think it was really fun. For the next game,
at least they tried to get rid of the free-to-play stuff. That's nice they did that at least.
Yeah.
Good for them.
For the next game, We talked about this before when we were talking about all of the games of the Final Fantasy 13 subseries, the Fabula Nova Crystallis. I mentioned it. I said we were going to talk about it now, so we're going to talk about it now. This game is called Final Fantasy Type 0, and it was originally announced as Final Fantasy Agido 13, and then they renamed it to Type 0 to sort of distance itself from the sort of flaming garbage fire that was public opinion surrounding Final Fantasy 13. But they released it in 2011 on the PlayStation Portable. The game follows Class 0, a group of military students that have to fight in a war between countries. The gameplay itself is super similar to Crisis Core, which is awesome. I love Crisis Core, so I really need to go back and play this game. It's very action-oriented, and it revolves around the team going on missions that are given to them by their school. So you kind of have like a home base that gives you missions. You go out, you do the mission, you come back, and you gain experience and combat stats, and probably at the end, you fight a god, because that's how Final Fantasy games work.
I forgot to ask you, Tyler, do you own a PSP?
I do own a PSP. I have a Star Wars one with Darth Vader helmet on the back.
That's so cool. PSP, I feel like, is an underrated system.
It is. And they're super hackable now, and they have all kinds of like fun emulators and stuff you can install.
Everyone go out and get yourself a cheap PSP.
Mm-hmm.
Live your best life.
Yep. The screen is very low res now. When you look at it, you're like, ooh, this is tough. But back in the day, it was awesome. So, yeah. Type 0 got pretty good reviews, and it sold decently well. It sold well enough that in 2015, Square decided to do an HD remake of the games for Xbox One and PS4, and then a few months later, PC. I haven't spent too much time with it, but I would love to because I have it for Xbox, and I never really put real time into it, which is a bummer, and I hate thinking about games that I have bought and not played.
I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just sitting here staring at Mass Effect Andromeda.
Side note on Type 0, the game had its own song, which was done by a band called Bump of Chicken. I don't really know what to do with that information. I'm just putting it out there because it seemed like something I should mention.
And that's also something the listeners need to know.
Yeah. If you want to download some Bump of Chicken, they have 8 albums apparently, so they're prolific. You can find a lot of Bump of Chicken content on the internet.
Bump of Chicken, yep. All bangers. I'll say it right now. All
100%.
Bangers. Check it out.
So, last game on the list here is one of my favorite spin-offs, The World of Final Fantasy. I've been talking about it a lot on the show because when we talk about what you've been playing, I'm playing it every week. Spoiler alert. I'm still playing it. But it's super fun. I just really like this game. So it came out in 2016 on the PS4 and PS Vita, and then in 2018 on the Switch and Xbox One. I have it for PS4 and Switch because I can't control myself. Anyway, the game has like a cute chibi art style where the main characters, Lon and Rain, attempt to defeat bad guys and discover more of their dark, mysterious past. The story is not a lot. There's not a whole lot going on there. But it gets the job done, and maybe it's going to pick up pretty soon. I still haven't finished it. There's some like mysterious stuff surrounding their mother and how they're able to control monsters and stuff like that, which seems like it might get pretty interesting. Do you think at the end
you might fight a god, maybe?
I hope so. If I don't, I'm going to be super disappointed.
Then they got to take the Ford's Final Fantasy out of it, in my opinion.
That's right. I agree. So the battle system is pretty neat. It takes most of the cool stuff of the ATB system that's a staple of the Final Fantasy series, and it adds in a little bit of Pokemon, kind of like Final Fantasy 13 too. So basically, you have 2 stacks in battle. Each one has 3 things in it, so you have a total of like 6 entities in battle, characters in battle. So you create these 2 stacks consisting of large, medium, and small creatures in each stack. And then the only other requirement is that Lon and Rain are each in one of the stacks, and they can be either large or medium. If you choose medium, they turn into these like little cute little chibi versions of themselves, which is really adorable. But the rest of the stack gets filled out by mirages that you've caught. Those are the monsters in the game. And the whole stack gains the stats and abilities of the characters that are within it. Other than that, it's just kind of a standard Final Fantasy ATV system. Random battles, all that, and then progression is like a sort of like a simplified sphere grid that each character has, where you sort of get the illusion of choice as you move through, but there's like not a whole lot of choice. But it's still cool. I think where this game really shines is in the fan service. Everywhere you go, the game is full of Final Fantasy references. Almost every new area that you get to has a cameo appearance by a chibi version of a Final Fantasy character, and then pretty much all of the mirages in the game can be found in other games. They're monsters of one form or another. It's like a really just a nice love letter to the entire Final Fantasy franchise, and I highly recommend anybody who loves Final Fantasy to check it out. It has generally favorable reviews. It didn't sell very well, though. I'm not really expecting a sequel, and I'm kind of okay with that, too. But, yeah, that's it. That's really all I've got on side games and spin-offs for now. I know I didn't cover everything, and I didn't really intend to, as I said at the top of the show, but if I missed something big, or if you just want to rant about Final Fantasy to someone who will listen, send us an email, codexhistorypodcast@gmail.com. I want to hear what your favorite Final Fantasy spin-offs are. And now, Mike, I want to hear what you've been playing.
Well, Tyler, I went on a trip. I had a comedy weekend. It was kind of a big deal. I was headlining my first ever comedy club. Big thing. It's Skyline Comedy Club in Appleton, Wisconsin. It was really fun. Had a great weekend. But because of that, I did not play a lot of games. I played some Fire Emblem on the plane ride there, which was fun. Okay. Always fun to play Fire Emblem.
That's on your
Awakening.
3DS, right?
On my 2DS, yeah.
Yeah.
On my Pikachu 2DS with the nose bump. It's a 3D nose bump of Pikachu's face, so it makes it even more adorable.
It's adorable.
Yeah. And then I didn't really play like I kind of fallen off the Destiny train. We were just talking about this before we started. I mean, I like Destiny, don't get me wrong, but I feel like right now the way it's progressing, I don't really feel like I need to do stuff in the game. I might play my comp matches this week, just to kind of, stay on top of that, because that is something I've been grinding all season, and I want to stay on top of that. But I'm losing so much in comp. Like, I'm getting to the higher parts of the rank system, so I'm losing a lot more, and I'm like, I don't even know if I'm getting any progression. Like, this is not great. So we'll see what happens. I do have the Outer Wilds on my Xbox, and I want to start that this week because everyone I've talked to has said it's a really fun and cool game, and I really want to play it. So I am going to be playing that, I believe, this week, and so I'll probably be able to talk about that next week. Also, I will be playing a game for next week's episode that a listener last week mentioned to us. So that's what I'm trying to do for next week. So not a lot this week, but next week I should have more. Tyler, what have you been playing?
I have been playing most of the same stuff that I've been playing every week. We've been talking, still working my way through World of Final Fantasy. I'm on chapter 18 of what I think is 21 chapters or 22 chapters. And I've been playing lots of Final Fantasy 14. I'm getting geared up. So last week we beat the raid for the first time, the easy mode raid, Eden's Gate. We beat it again this week, so I'm getting all my tokens so that I can get my upgraded gear. And now I'm just on the grind, just doing my dailies, trying to get my upgraded gear in the hopes that one day we'll be able to take on the super hard raid called Eden's Gate Savage Mode. Very excited for that. Savage Mode. That's intense. I need to gear up and level up and all that kind of stuff to make sure that I can take on the challenges that lie within Eden's Gate Savage Mode. Other than that, let's have a look around. I started playing a little bit of Forza Horizon 4 today because that game's on Game Pass. And I don't know if I'm going to stick with it because I'm generally not into racing games, but I don't know, sometimes I get the itch to play some races, so I fire it up. And it's beautiful. It's like one of the prettiest games I've ever seen, and it runs super smooth on my computer, and it's pretty cool. And it's on Game Pass, so like I'm not really losing anything by playing it for a minute and then stopping.
Forza Horizon?
Yeah. I've
heard the Horizon ones are really fun because like the Forza series itself is much like more simulation.
Yeah.
And the Horizon ones are kind of like an open world kind of deal, right?
Yeah. I think the idea is that you're at the Horizon Festival, which is like a car racing festival. It reminds me of, I spent the last week watching all of the Fast and the Furious movies, so it reminds me of the thing in those movies called Race Wars, which is like where a whole bunch of racers show up out in the desert to like race cars, I guess. Anyway, Horizon Festival reminds me of the Race Wars Festival from Fast and the Furious.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, it's fun. Oh, speaking of Fast and Furious, I did see Hobbs and Shaw last night, which was just awesome. That's a movie that just knows what it is, it's a superhero movie. It doesn't really try to be serious. There's a lot of points in that movie where they know that they're making a ridiculous movie, and it is super fun. Also, Ryan Reynolds shows up in it in the best way. It's basically Deadpool with inside of Fast and the Furious. I don't know. I loved it. It was fun. It was so fun.
I want to see it. I'm really behind in that whole like Fast and the Furious movies. I think I saw the one in theaters that was like right after Paul Walker's death, where they do the thing at the end of it because it was like posthumous. They like changed the ending, you know?
Yeah.
But
you're only one behind then.
Well, I haven't seen the ones before that either. I stopped after Tokyo Drift, and then I saw the Paul Walker one, and I haven't seen anything else. So I'm kind of behind.
That's when they get good. Right after Tokyo Drift, where they really start to pick up. That's when they realize that they're not realistic racing movies, but like cheesy superhero movies.
See, and that's what I need to watch. Yeah, because it was pretty. I mean, that one was pretty great too. It was really fun. So
I like Tokyo Drift, and it when you first watch it, it's like, oh, this is like pretty unrelated story wise to the other Final Fantasies, to the other Fast and Furious movies, and then later on, every movie like incorporates more and more Tokyo Drift storyline into it, where you're just like, oh wow, that was actually a really important movie.
Oh yeah, you gotta check that out. I should look. I'm gonna look into them. I'm gonna do it. But Tyler, we got some exciting news.
Oh boy, tell me what the exciting news is, Mike.
We got 2 new reviews on iTunes.
Oh,
Reviews.
yeah.
So the first one is a smiley face and 5 stars, and it's from Ultimate Codex, and it says, "You guys are great." Oh, thank you so much.
Oh, thanks.
One of my favorite things to do is watch videos on the history of video games. So this podcast gives me the same joy while working or driving in my car. Keep up the work, and I'll be tuning in every week. Thank you so much. Also, he wants to let us know that his gamer tag is Codex, and he says, coincidence? I think not. And I say, you know what? Maybe I shouldn't have said that on the podcast. But it's too late now, so hopefully you'll get some friends on Xbox or wherever it is. The next one, just a Saturday, was from J. John Wrestling, 5 stars, awesome stuff! Exclamation point. Love the podcast, entertaining on so many levels. That's what I try to go for, is multiple levels of entertainment. That's a thing for us. Thank you, J. John Wrestling, and thank you, Ultimate Codex. And if you want to leave us a review, we'd really appreciate it. You don't have to. As always, we'd love it if you told your friends. That'd be fun, too.
Yeah, that means a lot.
Just, we don't really advertise this show. We do it for the love of the games, okay? And as like Tyler said before, you can email us at codexhistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can tweet at us. I'm Mecoletta, Mecoletta. Tyler is Sneaker Elf, ELPH, and we're there, and that's where we live, and you can come talk to us there. And with that, next week, I'll be looking into a little bit of a game called Undertale.
Oh, yeah.
Ooh.
I'm excited for this one. I don't know very much about Undertale.
I'm hoping it's not. If it's kind of a shorter episode, which it might be, I might throw in maybe another indie series that's kind of big, just to do like 2 big indies. Because I mean, I haven't looked into it yet. I haven't done it. I want to play the game first before I look into anything. So I want to make sure there's enough there. Is the big thing. But yeah, I'm really excited to do this. That was a listener recommendation. So thank you for that. Golden Azrael Dreamer. Remember him? Her, them. I don't really know who it is, but you know what? I love them. That's what I think. So we'll do that for them. And then, that's the show today, I think.
Cool.
Fun stuff. Thank you for doing all these Final Fantasies, Tyler.
Oh, I'm happy to be over with it.
It's weird that
I love Final Fantasy, but I'm good talking about it for a while, you know?
I love that the Final Fantasy podcast series felt just as long as a Final Fantasy game.
Yeah, just about.
We're the JRPG of podcasting. Well, thank you so much for listening, and goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.